A millionaire found a single mom washing her son's clothes in the sink. What happened next? Room 506 at Horizon Suites was so quiet that afternoon, the drip from the showerhead could be heard one drop at a time. A faint yellow light spilled across the worn tile floor, casting uneven patches of reflection. Sophie Bennett was bent over the sink, her hands red and raw from too much water, her fingers trembling as they scrubbed her little boy's clothes. The scent of cheap detergent mixed with damp air, giving the room a heavy, quiet sadness. A frayed bath towel lay across the rim of the sink. On it, a small pair of jeans, still dark and wet, clung to stubborn bubbles of soap that hadn't been rinsed away. Sophie bit her lip and bent lower, determined to work out the stain. She didn't hear the knock at first, only when a low voice called out did she jolt upright. "Someone in there?" She turned, heart pounding. A man stood in the doorway, wearing a gray shirt, faded jeans, a tool bag slung over his shoulder. Sophie blurted quickly, her voice tangled with worry. "I'm sorry. Please don't report me. I swear I'm not using hotel supplies. I didn't have quarters for the laundromat, and my son needs clean clothes. I'll clean everything up. Just please don't tell the manager. I can't lose this job." Her voice shook like her hands, red and swollen from the cold water. She kept her gaze low, her body angled to shield the sink as if afraid someone might take it away. The man stepped in a little, his shadow stretching across the floor. She saw the name tag, Ethan, but had no idea this was Ethan Calloway, CEO of the entire Horizon Suites chain. Ethan stayed silent for a few seconds. His eyes lingered on the tiny jeans, the worn towel, the raw skin on her hands. He knew this feeling. Years ago, he had crouched over a gas station sink, washing his only shirt with the cheapest bar soap he could find, scrubbing and praying no one would walk in. That memory, long buried, rose sharp and vivid. He drew a slow breath and said quietly, "I'm not here to report you." Sophie looked up, startled. A faint streak of soap clung to her cheek, her ponytail messy with loose strands falling out. "I was called to fix the leak," Ethan added, gesturing toward the faucet. Sophie nodded faintly, still wary. "This is my own soap," she said softly. "It's almost empty, but I wasn't stealing. My son only has a few sets of clothes." Ethan set his tool bag gently on the floor, crouching beside the sink to open the cabinet. Just a loose pipe, 5 minutes of work at most. But he didn't start right away. His eyes drifted back to the towel, the tiny jeans, the slow drip of water, and the woman standing guard over the sink as if it were the last bit of dignity she had. In his mind, she wasn't an employee caught breaking rules. She was him, years ago, surviving quietly. Ethan stood up without another word and walked out, leaving behind the faint scent of soap and a silence heavy enough to press against the walls. Sophie stayed where she was, unsure why the man had left, without fixing anything at all. Ethan stepped out of room 506, closing the door softly as if afraid to shatter the fragile quiet that lingered inside. He stood in the hallway for a long moment, watching thin bands of light spill through the frosted glass. The drip of the faucet still echoed in his head, tangled with the image of Sophie's raw hands and guarded eyes. He knew exactly what that felt like, the desperate need to protect the last small shred of privacy you have, the fear that a single word could bring it all crashing down. That image pulled him back to a time he had buried deep, a time he thought he'd left behind. But it had been there all along, waiting for a moment like this to resurface. Years ago, Ethan Calloway had been in that same place. He had never known what a warm home felt like. His parents died in a car accident when he was only 3. His childhood was confined within the gray walls of an orphanage, where the sharp smell of bleach and the slam of iron doors became the daily rhythm. Ethan was the quiet boy, always watching, rarely speaking. In the noisy crowd of children, he was easy to forget, sitting in a corner with a worn book or staring out a dusty window pane. He learned early hope was allowed, but expectations were dangerous. At 18, the orphanage handed him a small bag and called it freedom. That freedom quickly became a fight for survival. He slept under bridges, in shelters, in the cold stairwells of apartment buildings. Meals were crusts of bread, sometimes, if luck allowed, a leftover can of soup. He took any job he could, washing dishes, unloading trucks, mopping storerooms, anything for a few coins to buy the cheapest dinner he could find. On nights curled under a thin coat, Ethan made a silent vow: never be this helpless again. A year later, he met Rachel, a dark-haired woman with a warm smile and eyes that listened, at a rundown coffee shop. Rachel believed in him in a way he didn't believe in himself. Along with a childhood friend, they started a small lodging business. 3 people, 1 dream, and nothing else but faith. Ethan worked himself to the bone, greeting guests by day, cleaning rooms by night, changing every burnt-out bulb, counting every cent in their expenses. He believed in the business. He believed in them. Until one morning he woke to an empty bed, empty bank accounts, and a vanished company. Rachel and his friend were gone, taking everything, money and trust alike. That betrayal cut deeper than poverty ever had. Ethan withdrew, wrapping himself in iron armor. He rebuilt from nothing, this time with strict systems, absolute control, and a heart locked away. Years later, Horizon Suites stood among the most prestigious hotel chains in the region. Ethan became a millionaire before the age of 40. The name Calloway carried both respect and wariness. But no one knew that every time he looked in the mirror, he still saw the young man crouched over a sink, washing his only shirt, praying no one would see. Sophie Bennett once had a very different path. She had been an outstanding nursing student, top of her class during clinical rotations. Her dream was to work in pediatrics, where tiny hands needed gentle, patient care. But in her final year of school, she discovered she was pregnant. Her fiancé, the man who had promised to stay by her side, left just weeks after hearing the news. Sophie tried to keep studying, but the night shifts at her internship and relentless morning sickness wore her down. Then her mother fell ill. The long-term illness drained what little savings they had. Sophie was forced to leave school, taking any job she could find to cover hospital bills and prepare for the baby's arrival. Ben was born in a small maternity ward without a father in sight. For the first months, Sophie lived with her mother to save money. But as her mother's condition worsened, she could no longer help care for the baby. Sophie accepted a full-time job as a housekeeper at Horizon Suites, a position that came with a tiny staff room in the basement. That room barely fit a single bed, a worn wooden dresser, and a small window that faced a concrete wall. For Sophie, it was the only home she could give Ben. Her modest paycheck barely covered her mother's hospital costs, formula for Ben, and a few changes of clothes. The laundromat was 3 blocks away, but every load cost money she needed for meals. So at night, when the hallways were empty, Sophie would carry Ben's clothes to the staff sink or an unused guest room, washing them in cold water with cheap soap. Even with her hands cracked from chemicals in cold water, Sophie kept a smile at work. Not the smile of someone untouched by hardship, but the smile of someone who had learned to carry it as part of herself, determined not to let it break her. The next morning, when Sophie opened the door to her staff room, she found a small paper bag neatly placed on the floor. No note, no signature. Inside was a packet of laundry detergent, much better quality than what she usually used, and a prepaid card for the staff laundry machine in the basement. Sophie froze. She glanced up and down the empty hallway, hearing only the distant hum of a vacuum cleaner. No one appeared. She held the card tightly in her hand, torn between wanting to find the person who had sent it and fearing that doing so might break the quiet warmth of the gesture. That evening, for the first time in weeks, she washed Ben's clothes in warm water. The scent of clean fabric filled the tiny room, and for a moment, all her exhaustion seemed to lift. In the days that followed, Sophie began noticing the maintenance man named Ethan Moore. He always seemed to appear just when a hallway light was flickering or the dryer made an odd noise. Their exchanges were brief. "Did the dryer work okay yesterday?" "Yes, thank you." Or, "That west hallway light still flickering?" "Yes, I think it needs a new bulb." But Sophie noticed that he always asked with genuine interest, not the perfunctory tone of someone ticking off a task. Ethan, meanwhile, found himself watching Sophie more closely. He saw her pushing the linen cart, her sneakers worn thin at the heels. He saw her wiping down the front desk counter while her hands were cracked from cleaning chemicals. And yet, no matter how tired she looked, she greeted everyone with a smile that wasn't forced. He began arranging his tasks so he could, coincidentally, cross paths with Sophie's work route. When they met, it was just a few scattered questions, but to him it was a way of letting her know. Someone saw her. Ethan had built an empire by focusing on numbers, reports, efficiency. But since meeting Sophie, he realized there were things no chart could measure, like the strength of a woman who remained steady when she had nothing left but willpower. And in that quiet resilience, he felt something inside himself begin to melt. The 7th-floor hallway was quieter than usual that morning. Fluorescent light spilled over the beige carpet, casting a cold, pale glow. Sophie stood beside her housekeeping cart, head slightly bowed, listening to the sharp voice of Mr. Hanley, the floor manager. He held a clipboard, tapping a pen against its edge in quick, impatient beats. "I had to hear this from a guest." "A guest, Bennett? The bathtub was still dirty. How do you explain that?" Sophie gripped the cleaning rag in her hand, her voice small but steady. "Sir, I did clean it, but the pipe under the tub is leaking. The water comes out rusty. I wiped it twice." "I'm not interested in excuses. If you can't handle a bathtub, maybe this isn't the right job for you." The words sliced through the air like a knife. Heat rose to Sophie's cheeks, but she kept her tone even. The utility closet door across the hall opened. Ethan stepped out, a coil of electrical wire in his hand. He hadn't meant to overhear, but Hanley's voice carried down the empty hallway. His eyes fixed on Sophie, her shoulders drawn in, her hand clutching the rag as if it were the only thing keeping her steady. He had been here before, accused without a chance to explain, dignity stripped away in front of others. Ethan stepped forward, his voice low but sharp. "It's your plumbing that leaks, not her work." Hanley spun around. "Excuse me?" Ethan pulled a maintenance report from his back pocket, holding it up. Room 714's had a leaking pipe under the bathtub since last Thursday. The stains come from behind the tile, rusty water, repairs already scheduled. Silence filled the space. Hanley's mouth opened, but no words came out. Ethan didn't stay to see Sophie's reaction. He glanced at her, just long enough to send a quiet assurance, then walked away, the coil of wire still in his hand. That afternoon, Ethan received a warning email from upper management. He had overstepped authority, undermined floor supervision. He read it, printed it out, folded it neatly, then tossed it into the trash. Elsewhere in the hotel, Sophie stood by the vending machine, still processing what had happened. No one had ever stood up for her before, especially not in front of Mr. Hanley. Part of her wanted to thank him, but part of her feared she wouldn't be able to say anything beyond a simple "thank you." When she saw Ethan walking through the back corridor, she called softly, "Ethan!" He stopped. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "You didn't deserve it." She paused, then asked, "Why do you care so much, Martin, about someone like me?" Ethan looked at her, his gaze reaching deeper than the question itself. His voice dropped, "Because someone should." Without waiting for her reply, he walked away. Between them, something had been stirred, not loud, but strong. 3 days after the incident in the 7th-floor hallway, Sophie returned to her staff room after a late shift. As she opened the door, she stopped short. On the worn carpet just outside lay a small package, wrapped in brown paper and tied with a simple string. She knelt and opened it. Inside was a pair of thick, soft wool gloves and a small tube of hand cream. No note, but Sophie didn't need one to know who had left it. She sat down on her bed, the gloves resting in her lap. For months her hands had been cracked from chemicals, sometimes bleeding. Touching the warm softness of the wool, she felt her throat tighten. It wasn't the cost of the gift. It was the feeling of being seen. The next evening, light rain fell as Sophie left the hotel through the back door. Under the small metal awning, Ethan stood with his phone in hand, the streetlight casting a warm glow on his face. When their eyes met, Sophie paused. "I think I owe someone a thank you," she said softly. "I don't know what you mean," Ethan replied, but the corner of his mouth curved and his eyes warmed. They both laughed quietly. The sound of rain filled the spaces between their words. Then the conversation began, unrushed, unguarded. They talked about the best instant noodles for the lowest price, about $2 coffee that still tasted fine, and which vending machine snack gave the most bang for its buck. Sophie spoke about Ben, his endless fascination with dinosaurs, the bedtime reading sessions where they hunted for more facts about T-Rex. Then her voice softened. "I used to dream of becoming a nurse, but life chose a different direction." Ethan looked at her, not as an employee, but as the person inside. "You'd make a good one," he said gently, but with certainty. The rain slowed, casting golden reflections in the puddles at their feet. In that moment, Ethan realized Sophie was the first person who had made him truly laugh, without armor, without pretense, and he wanted to know what might come next. That morning, the staff lounge was livelier than usual. Someone had wheeled in a small TV and set it on the old wooden table. Paper cups of coffee passed from hand to hand, laughter and murmurs buzzing through the air. Apparently, the CEO of Horizon Suites is doing a live stream tour of the branches today. He's probably going to be in a suit with bodyguards, not like any of us. Sophie stood at the back of the room, her hand resting on the handle of her cart. She allowed herself a few extra minutes, curiosity winning over her usual routine. But in her mind, she was still replaying the rainy night with Ethan, the gloves, the small tube of hand cream. The screen flickered on, the Horizon Suites logo appearing, followed by the image of a grand hotel lobby in another city. Camera flashes went off, reporters lined up. And then, he walked out. Ethan, in a perfectly tailored navy suit, polished leather shoes, stepping up to the podium with the measured smile of someone used to the spotlight. Sophie blinked, thinking her eyes were playing tricks. But no, it was the same man who had asked about hallway lights, who had left detergent at her door, who had stood by her in front of Mr. Hanley. Around her, the room erupted. "Oh my God, he's actually the CEO. Told you, he didn't look like maintenance." But Sophie barely heard them. Her heartbeat slowed, then surged. Every word Ethan spoke on screen came from someone who felt like a stranger. "I've spent the last 3 months working undercover across various branches. I've met single mothers, immigrants, people working 2 jobs. They are the foundation of our brand. I went to improve operations, but what I found changed me." Sophie stood still, her hands growing cold. He had known all along. He had power, money, a name, and he had said nothing. One question dug deep into her mind. Did you help me because you cared, or because I was a good story to tell? On screen, Ethan smiled, shook hands, posed for photos. Sophie turned and quietly left the lounge. No one noticed. She changed out of her uniform, unpinned her name tag, and hung it on the hook. That afternoon, the sky was gray and damp. Sophie stepped out the employee entrance, not because she wanted to quit, but because her heart needed space to breathe, away from the lights, away from the eyes, away from him. 3 days blurred past. In that time, Ethan barely slept, each morning scanning the shift schedule in hope of her name, only to find the same empty space. Her cart sat untouched in storage, her name tag gone. He didn't know where to begin. In business, he could turn a complicated deal around with a few lines of negotiation, but this left him feeling as uncertain as he had at 18. On Friday afternoon, under a pale golden sky, Ethan walked into the elementary school 4 blocks from the hotel. He remembered Sophie mentioning it, the place where Ben had show-and-tell Fridays, where the teacher gave out dinosaur stickers. That day, there was a small parent gathering. Folding chairs filled the multipurpose room, children running around clutching juice boxes. Ethan stood at the back, out of place in his dark jacket and worn shoes. He approached a teacher's aide, his voice soft but firm. "I would like to say a few words." When the classroom announcements ended, the teacher gestured for Ethan to come forward. He stepped up, every eye turning toward him. But he didn't look at them. He looked toward the doorway, where he hoped Sophie was. "I know I don't belong here," he began. "And I'm not here to talk about work. I'm here because I made a mistake." His voice was slow, steady. "I met a woman who works harder than anyone I've ever known. She raises her child with love, grit, and quiet sacrifice. She reminded me what real strength looks like. Not loud, not proud, but steady every single day." He paused, his gaze lifting toward the hall. "I didn't help her because I'm a CEO. I helped because I remember what it feels like to wash your only shirt in a sink and hope nobody sees." Outside, Sophie leaned against the wall by the door, her hand covering her mouth. Tears filled her eyes, not because of the apology, but because he had stepped into a space that belonged to her world and spoken the truth there, without making it about himself. Inside, Ethan finished simply, "She may never forgive me. That's not why I'm here. I just want her to know. What she does matters. She matters. And I believe kindness never needs a stage, but sometimes it deserves to be seen." He bowed his head, thanked the teacher, and quietly walked out. As he passed the spot where Sophie stood, his eyes flickered toward her for the briefest second, enough to say what words could not. Then he kept walking, leaving her with the space and the choice of what came next. That morning, the air in the Horizon Suites lobby felt different, not because of the weather, but because of the glances. As Sophie walked through the door, a few heads nodded, a few warm smiles greeted her. The doorman was the first. "Welcome back, Bennett." Then the front desk clerk offering only a quiet smile and, "Good to see you." Even the usually stern housekeeping supervisor gave a small nod. There was no pity in their eyes, only respect. Sophie made her way through the service corridor, everything so familiar it was as if she had never left. But her hand still trembled slightly. She hadn't seen Ethan since that afternoon at the school. She didn't know what she would say when she did. The maintenance room door was ajar. Inside, Ethan was bent over an old wooden chair, scrubbing a stain from the cushion. The soft squeak of cloth against fabric filled the quiet. He hadn't noticed her yet. Sophie stepped inside, her voice barely above a breath. "You don't have to fix everything." Ethan looked up. Their eyes met and held for a few long seconds. "Just stay," she added. The cloth slipped from his hand, falling to the floor. Ethan took a slow step toward her, then another. "I thought I'd lost you," he said quietly. "You didn't," Sophie replied, her eyes shining. "You just had to let me find my way back." He reached for her hand. She let him take it. In the golden wash of light streaming through the small maintenance room window, they stood close, not as a CEO and an employee, but as two people who had carried pain alone and were now ready to share the weight. The changes came slowly, but surely. Ethan Calloway was no longer just the name on the Horizon Suites sign. He stood before the gathered staff, not in a tailored suit, but in a simple navy sweater, announcing a new set of policies. Support programs for single parents, free mental health counseling for employees, and full scholarships for anyone wanting to return to school. At first, the room was silent. Then the applause began, strong, steady, and lasting. Among those clapping that day, Sophie stood in the front row. She was now a member of the Guest Experience Advisory Board, invited to speak during new staff training. "I used to think this was just a job," she said, her voice steady but full of feeling. "But someone reminded me that people matter more than positions, and that kindness is a kind of leadership too." Months later, the hotel's grand lobby was transformed into a surprise celebration. Balloons floated near the ceiling, a long table held a dinosaur-themed cake, and employees from every department brought small gifts for a 5-year-old boy. Ben beamed as he unwrapped a T-Rex hoodie. Across the room, Ethan held a bouquet of balloons, quietly watching, joy shining in his eyes. When Ben ran to him, wrapping small arms around his leg, and asked, "Are you going to be my new dad?" Ethan froze, then looked at Sophie. She smiled through tears and nodded. That evening, after the guests had left, they walked together down the familiar hallway. Stopping in front of room 506, Ethan rested his hand on the doorknob. "This is where I first really saw you," he said. "And this is where you reminded me." "I was worth being seen," Sophie replied. He opened the door and sunlight poured in. The past was still there, but now it was only the foundation for a new beginning. That spring, the garden behind Horizon Suites bloomed in the soft blush of cherry blossoms, petals drifting like whispers on the breeze. When a coworker asked Sophie to help arrange flowers, she expected nothing more than a quick favor, until she stepped under the archway of blooms and saw him. But as she passed under the carefully woven floral arch, she stopped. Ethan was there, his gaze fixed on her as if no one else existed. He stepped forward slightly, a rare hesitance in his smile. "Ben told me I should do this where his mom feels safest," he said, then knelt, opening a navy velvet box. Inside lay a simple yet elegant ring, gleaming with the weight of all they had been through. "Sophie Bennett, you've turned this hotel into a home, turned my past into something I'm no longer afraid of. Will you make the rest of my life a place we both belong?" Sophie's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes blurring with tears. She nodded, and Ben ran to wrap his arms around them both, his laughter mingling with the applause of the staff gathered around. 3 months later, the grand lobby of Horizon Suites no longer looked like its usual polished self, but like a place welcoming something far more personal: their wedding. Instead of extravagant flowers, Sophie chose sprigs of lavender and crisp white linens. As she walked down the aisle, she no longer felt like the housekeeper she had once been. Ethan stood waiting at the end, his eyes steady, just like that first afternoon in room 506. Their vows were simple, making no promises of riches, only the promise to stay, even in the hardest of days. When Ethan said, "I promise to always stay," Sophie smiled through her tears and held his hand tighter. A year later, they welcomed Grace, a tiny baby girl with eyes bright enough to bring the sky indoors. Ben proudly introduced his sister to anyone who visited, while Ethan mastered holding her in one arm while stirring the breakfast pot with the other. Life wasn't perfect. There were sleepless nights and rushed mornings. But in their home, laughter always outnumbered sighs. In the living room, on a wooden shelf, sat a framed photo of the family standing in front of room 506. On the back, Ethan had handwritten one simple line: "One old room, one sink, and a second chance changed everything." And every time they looked at it, they knew they had found the most valuable thing, not a fairy tale, but a real life where two people chose to stay, no matter what came their way. One late summer afternoon, golden sunlight slanted through the living room window, stretching into warm streaks across the wooden floor. Sophie sat in an armchair, cradling a sleeping Grace, the baby's tiny fingers curled loosely into her mother's shirt. Ben sat on the floor, carefully stacking Lego blocks into a miniature hotel, occasionally looking up to ask whether he should add another floor or a window. Ethan walked in, his shirt slightly rumpled from running errands, a thick envelope in his hand. He set it down on the table and sat beside Sophie, his eyes carrying both seriousness and the boyish excitement of sharing a new dream for the first time. "I have a proposal," he began, sliding the envelope toward her. Inside was a detailed blueprint for a new hotel project, this time not a luxury property and not under the Horizon Suites name. This was a small, affordable chain designed for people trying to start over. "I want to call it Second Chance," Ethan said, his voice low but sure. "Not just to give them a temporary roof, but to train skills, create jobs, and build a safe environment for people who need a new beginning, like we once did." Sophie stared at the paper, her heart resonating with every word. She remembered the feeling of walking into the staff room for the first time, with cracked hands and the fear of being left behind. She looked up and met Ethan's gaze, the man who had once appeared in the doorway of room 506 with a tool bag and who had changed the way she saw herself. "We'll do it," she said softly, her smile opening like a promise. Ben, not fully understanding, ran over to show off his Lego building. "Can I name my hotel Second Chance, too?" Both of them laughed, and Ethan ruffled his hair, nodding his approval. Outside, the late summer breeze stirred the branches, carrying the faint scent of lavender from the garden. Ben's laughter, Grace's even breathing, and the quiet squeeze of hands between Sophie and Ethan blended into a wordless melody of peace. But somewhere within this gentle rhythm of life, a new door was opening, not just for them, but for dozens, hundreds of people they would meet, helping them walk from the darkness into a place called home. And perhaps years from now, someone else will tell the story of Second Chance, the way they once told the story of a sink, a second chance, and two people who chose to stay. And maybe this story is only just beginning.